Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Leading Issue, our podcast with today's leaders about the management issues that matter. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome as my guest Dame Ann Richards. Dame Ann is the winner of CMI's Lifetime Achievement Award and the CEO of Fidelity International, a position she's held since 2018. She's also a lifelong campaigner for equality in the workplace and started her career as an engineer. Welcome, Ann. I'm delighted to have you on the podcast.
And Anne, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Brilliant. Well, let's start with your career. Give us the whistle-stop tour.
Gosh, it's been a very long time that I've been working, so it's quite hard to do that. I'll try and be relatively succinct. I went to my local high school. I loved maths at school. I loved lots of other subjects as well, but I particularly loved maths, and I didn't really know what to do with it. So I had a lovely physics teacher who said to me, Anne, you should think about doing engineering because what you really love doing is solving problems. So that led me to study engineering at the University of Edinburgh. From that, I then went on to take up a position as a research fellow at CERN, the European Laboratory for Particle Physics. So I worked 6 years as an engineer, eventually came back to the UK after several years at CERN, worked for a firm of technology consultants for a period of time, and then was getting more into project management, business type issues, which led me eventually to do an MBA back in the European continent at INSEAD. Mm-hmm. And it was when I was at INSEAD that I discovered financial markets, which I'd never really looked at before. And I loved the constant vibrancy, the constant change, the way that no 2 days are ever the same. And I thought, well, I can always go back to being an engineer, but I'll never get the chance to try what it would be like to work in financial markets. And that's really what led me into investment management. I knew almost nothing about it. Started as an engineering analyst, and that then led on to first a portfolio manager type role, then eventually to a CIO, Chief Investment Officer role, and eventually to a chief executive role, all within that investment management industry. So that's my pocket size description of 30 plus years, very nearly 40 years actually, of working life.
So that's a brilliant pocket-sized description. And I want to ask you, as the winner of CMI's Lifetime Achievement Award, tell us a little bit about your management style. How would you characterize it? And how perhaps has it evolved over the years as you've progressed in your own career?
It's a very difficult thing to try and describe your own management style because, of course, you're the one person in the room who doesn't experience it on the receiving end. So I find that a very difficult question. I suppose the tenets that I bring to anything that I'm trying to do within an organization, whether it was at the beginning just looking after a very small team of people, and then as time has gone on, more and more, is very much a problem-solving approach to the way I look at things. I tend to think problems, maybe it's the engineer in me, but problems can be solved, and you need a few things to solve them. You need great people, you need hard work, you need thoughtfulness around about it. And if you can work hard, if you can try and do the right thing, and if you can have some fun along the way because you've got the right people around about them, I suppose that's the ethos of what I'm trying to do, as you know, in management, in leadership. Whether that's what people feel I'm trying to do, I can't really answer that. But I think that's what I've always tried to do. And you asked the question, how has that evolved over time? I think when I started out, a lot of me would also would think, well, it's very obvious. These are the things we need to do. We need to break down the problem in this way, and then we need to go through these different steps to solve that problem. It's obvious to me. Why isn't it obvious to everybody else that's around about me? And over time, I've learned that people with different characteristics, sometimes because of what they've studied at university or their own life experiences, or sometimes just that innate nature, people come at things in very different ways. And therefore, just because it's completely obvious to me that this is what we should do, you should listen to the medieval historian or the philosopher or the medic or whoever else is sitting in that room, or the person that spent their career answering the phones, listening to customer problems, what are they saying? Why is their analysis of this situation different to yours? And then try and do that cross check. So I've tried, I think, to become much more aware that the difference of perspective that people bring doesn't necessarily mean that they are right, of course, and that you are wrong, or the other way around, but actually maybe there's something right in both approaches or both ways of doing things, and therefore you want to try and get the best of everything by pulling all these different things together. And I think that's something I've become less black and white as I've gone through. And final thought, I think, again, as somebody quite analytical in background, quite numbers oriented, words really matter. How you ask somebody to do something really matters. The way that you speak to the organization really matters. Words have power in them. And again, that's something which I've realized more and more, that you have to take real care, actually, particularly when you're speaking to a wider group rather than to a smaller group. It matters in a smaller group. It matters even more in a wider group. But, it's all, I don't feel I have all the answers on that. I feel that you have to keep learning and keep absorbing.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about words and also behaviors. And as a role model, how does that make you feel? Do you find that it changes your behavior because you're under a fair amount of scrutiny, or what's your thoughts about that?
I mean, there are no two words more terrifying in the English language, I think, than being told you're a role model. I mean, really, it's a terrifying responsibility. So I try not to think about it. I mean, I come back to work hard, try and do the right thing, keep the focus on that, be thoughtful about what you say, where you say it, and how you say it, but don't stop saying it, and accept that some of the time you're going to say things which either people disagree with, or even actually you might get it wrong sometimes and have to stand up and say, I said that and I shouldn't have said that, or I said that and I thought it was true, but actually it's turned out not to be true. And that is just life. I hate the words role model. I think they're terrifying words, like I said, but inevitably there's something that any of us who've ended up in positions where people look to us and listen to what we say and then judge us accordingly, you have to accept it comes with the territory a little bit, and you can't have responsibility with that.
Sure. And, I agree with you. It's an onerous term. We could just say somebody that people might look up to and want to learn from. But what's very interesting is that you said that over time you've learned to solicit and trust and respect, if not always agree with, other people's opinions or people that have different perspectives. In your acceptance speech, you actually said the greatest gift you can give someone is your trust. Why do you think that trust is so important in the workplace? And how do you as a leader go about cultivating it? What's your advice to others?
Trust is such an important thing. And I think I have realized relatively late what a powerful motivator of individuals trust is. When I look back now, I see that very often the thing that gave me the confidence to strike out in a different direction or take a new role was the trust that people had placed in me, that gave me the confidence that I was competent at least to try. I maybe wasn't competent to do it, but I was sufficiently worthy of giving it a go. And I do realize how much I valued that. I think what the pandemic and those long periods of lockdown that we had in so many parts of the world showed that wasn't unique to me. We saw that over and over and over again with people that we trusted because we had to trust them, because we had to keep the show on the road. We had to keep the wheels of the business turning. We look after other people's money, the money that really matters to their future security. So it was our absolute responsibility, while everything else was going mad in the world around about us, to do the thing that we were being asked to do by our customers, to do it really well. That meant we had to trust our people. because we in turn were being trusted by our customers. So I think the pandemic really brought home to me the importance and the value of trust. And trust is a fragile thing. It doesn't take a lot sometimes to shake it. By the same token, if you've got a team that really trusts each other, you can do great things because you're prepared to take a risk, because you know that somebody else will have your back if it doesn't quite work out how you expect. So it's a complex thing, trust. But I think at the heart of a successful business over multiple years, trust, being able to trust the people around about you, ultimately is more powerful than what you sometimes see are these very, particularly in financial services, actually, these very aggressive cultures of internal competition, which is the death knell of trust. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't aspire to be the best, that we shouldn't aspire to be competitive with all of the other businesses trying to do what we're trying to do out there. It's not saying that competition and excellence and all of those things don't really matter. They absolutely do. But if you don't trust each other as a team and don't know that you're working together for a common good, you will ultimately fail in your mission, because trust is what bails you out when you hit something completely unknown that allows you all to pull together.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you've referenced their cultures, and you and I have spoken before about how sometimes the sometimes rapid retreat that people are beating from the hybrid working culture to a everybody back in the office 5 days a week culture can maybe feel a little bit like that trust is being withdrawn. And you also mentioned that kind of internal competition in the office, and sometimes that manifests as, you know, the good people are back in the office and the bad people aren't. What do you feel about that as a leader, and you know, how do you manage that dilemma amongst your colleagues?
So I think there is an evolution, because I think in those lockdown periods when everybody was at home, unquestionably, we, for a period of time, were able to run the business based on the trust that had been built up through months, years of close working, co-working in an office environment. And so those bonds, those connections had been built up. And I have no doubt that some of those bonds have been weakened, particularly new people have come in, they're not party to them. So I'm not of the view that we can run our businesses 100% virtually all the time. And actually, to say what the right mix is, it's not a static thing. And I do think we are right now in a period where we have to look and say, in what is a very challenging external environment, where are there things that aren't working quite as well as they could do? Do we need more connectivity? Do we need more people physically side by side, whether it's to learn on the job or to build those those human connections? Where do we need more of that? Where is our efficiency perhaps not as good as it was? And is that in part because of where people are located? We have to be honest about asking those questions, and we have to be prepared to adapt about, you know, what is the right thing for the business as a whole. But having said all of that, we know now that we do not need everybody physically co-located 100% of the time for many, many, many of the tasks that we have to do in my business and in other businesses. So then if we are choosing to force people into that environment, do we really understand why? What is it that's changed? And if we don't need them there all the time, can we give them something that is additive to their world, less of a commute, more proximity to other things that matter in their lives at least part of the time? And can we get the blend right? But I think it's not static, Anne. I think that's one of the hard things that we've all been wrestling with. You know, we went from one extreme to the other, and we're finding our way through what happens in between. But trust matters. If I trust somebody to do the job because they're sitting 5 meters away from me, if they're sitting 5 miles away from me, you know, can I still trust them to do the job? And the answer very often is yes. Not necessarily all the time, but some of the time. And therefore, how do we get the balance right? I think it's a live thing, and it's a constant evolution, and it will ebb and flow a little bit, and that's okay too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think we agree on that, and we're evolving. And I think what is important is that we do that with from a position of trust, rather than, I want you back in the office because I don't trust you, or
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
I'm going to be monitoring your swipe card. Um, I think sometimes we do go a bit too far, and that comes across as withdrawal of trust, and that's obviously something to be avoided. But at the same time, completely agree about what you say about building that community, building a common culture, and also respecting that it's more possible for us to have more human interactions and that they do matter. But actually, one of the things about your career, which is very apparent, is that you've succeeded incredibly well in what are some very male-dominated industries: electrical engineering, the CERN experience, and financial services. What has your experience taught you about how to work in those male-dominated environments, and how best do we address them to make them more inclusive?
It's such a, I wish I had an easy answer to the question. I mean, when I look back, so I left school, I think, in 1981, roughly 1981, I think. And we were just coming into that period of time where, the legal structures that had perhaps discriminated, and I'm talking in the UK, but this is true in many other countries as well, had gradually started to shift and change. So my mother, as a qualified lawyer, had to leave her job when she married and had a child, because you could be in a non-professional role, but you couldn't be in a professional role in that situation. That was in the early 60s, so 20 years earlier. We knew that we had a very different legal structure around about us. And I suppose when I was coming into the workplace, it was in the belief that the disparity around about me was going to change naturally over time, because we had so much changes in the legal frameworks and, the equality under the law and all those sorts of things. So for at least the first 10, 15 years of my career, I genuinely believed that, yes, there were a lot of men around about me, but there'd be more and more women coming behind. And so the problem was gradually, the difference was gradually going to just disappear. And it was a bit of a shock, actually. And I remember quite clearly the environment I was in when we started. We and a handful of other senior women of my cohort in the late 90s, we sort of looked around us and we realized that it hadn't changed, that, those 10 to 15, years younger than us that were sort of starting to come through, the percentage hadn't really moved materially in the industries that we were talking about. And that's when I started to get more actively involved in thinking, maybe time isn't going to sort this out. And maybe it's not just the legal frameworks. Maybe there are other things around about which we need to look at. And I think if there was a single silver bullet, we would have found it by now. Mm-hmm. I have found the vast majority of the time, the vast majority of the men that I've worked with have been fantastic. Mm-hmm. And I've never felt by the vast majority treated differently. There is a small number who clearly did treat me differently, and perhaps even some who still do treat me differently. You can't worry about that, because you can't take on the world the whole time. You have to focus on what it is that you're good at. Can you be really good at it? Can you be obviously really good at it in such a way that it opens up other opportunities that then allow you to go on and prove yourself? And my career has really been about saying yes to stuff that was usually somewhat outside of my comfort zone, if I'm honest, but mm-hmm. doing stuff, maybe stuff that perhaps some of the more established figures thought were too risky. That's been quite often the path of female leadership. You do this stuff that other people are a bit less inclined to do. And it's kind of worked out for me, but I haven't spent a lot of time agonizing about my own situation. If I ever felt I was in a situation where being female was an active disadvantage, I moved. I got myself out of that situation. Is that the right thing to do? I don't know, but sometimes you just have to make your own choices, and you have to make your own opportunities and go and grab them. So I don't know that I have the answers of how I did it, and I just kept my head down, and maybe I was one of the lucky ones that didn't end up on the receiving end of some of the more unpleasant behavior that I know some people of my age in the industry have had. So, it's been a journey, and I've loved it for the most part.
Great. Well, it's interesting because one of the things that you said earlier is that you took these opportunities that took you out of your comfort zone in part because you felt other people trusted you, had confidence in you. That speaks to perhaps sponsorship, people believing in what you could do. If we go to some of the underrepresentation of women in some of those places like STEM or financial services, do you think that there's a role for more proactive sponsorship of more diverse talent to perhaps ensure not just that people enter those fields, but that they progress within them?
Yeah, I think sponsorship is very important. And I think I never sought sponsorship, but I was lucky that I fell into places where I ended up with people who were my advocates. I tend to think of them as advocates who became my advocates. And that wasn't just about what they did with other people when I wasn't in the room. It was also about giving me really sound advice, which I did not always take, by the way. But nonetheless, if you've got somebody giving you really sound advice, it makes you pause and think and look at both sides of something that you're considering. And that's a really helpful thing to do. You mentioned STEM. And I do think there is something around being comfortable with numbers. It probably helped me. I mean, I've always loved numbers. You give me a puzzle, I'm playing that puzzle, and so I never had maths insecurity. Now, the narrowness of much of the curriculum, particularly if you do A levels as opposed to some of the other qualifications you can take, whether in Scotland or the IB or various other things, tends to exclude maths relatively easily. Maths and physics, if you're only doing 3 or 4 A levels, it's very easy not to take maths and physics. Now, I don't think you want everybody taking maths and physics. I mentioned philosophers earlier, I really value different approaches and mindset. And I think there is no one area of study or life experience which makes you good at being a manager or being a leader or being in one industry versus another area. But the more you progress in an organization, you have to be comfortable with numbers, because numbers matter. They really do matter. And we're still in the UK, I think, sometimes too prone to diminishing the value of numbers. And therefore, if people leave school without being comfortable with numbers or with the mindset that numbers are not for them, it's just a tool. You don't need everybody to be a rocket scientist or a Nobel Prize winning mathematician, but you do need people in many, many jobs to be comfortable with basic statistics, basic numbers, a basic P&L, whatever it might be. So there's a lot about financial literacy. There's a lot about making sure that we have a broad enough curriculum to give everybody the tools that then give them many more choices as they go through later life. But if you get to be a mid-level person and you're not comfortable with numbers, you are not going to progress. You're really not. So, it's not the only thing that will solve different representation in different areas. But I think if we could get more women in particular, but some other underrepresented groups as well, more comfortable with numbers, it would be part of the problem.
Yes, I'm sure you're right there, and actually it resonates with me because I think I know some women who are quite math phobic, and to your point, sometimes it does get in the way of progress in organizations. But what about, for example, the engineer, changing the image of the engineer to help make those roles more attractive? I mean, the default image of the engineer is, the high-vis jacket, the hard hat on some sort of big superstructure out in the North Sea, or or on a building site. What's your view on the value of making people aware of the diversity of those roles?
Well, look, I think that's, absolutely, being an engineer is far more than the high vis vest and all the rest of it. I think we've made some progress in that, because genuinely, when I graduated, I mean, that was what the stock image of an engineer was. You know, if you speak to 20-year-olds today, they have a far more nuanced view of what an engineer is, partly because technology is now so ubiquitous in all of our lives that, and they understand that engineers are part of creating that technology. So, you know, I'm less, I think, concerned about the image of engineers. I think it's less about that off-putting, you know, people necessarily, than the fact that by the time you realize you might be actually interested in doing it, very often you've got to take a step back to then build the foundational skills you need to be able to do it. But it's been interesting for me, for example. I know 1 or 2 English graduates who've gone on to do data analytics courses and then have ended up working in the tech world with that combination of English and data analytics. And that's an example of how, you know, being an engineer versus being a data analyst, they're different. They're not so different. And, you know, you can see there's a sort of continuum and a spectrum. Therefore, I think it's about allowing our kids as they come through school to keep as many options open as possible, so that that doesn't become something that is too difficult to do later in life. I mean, I think when you think about the 50-year plus working life, within that, I mean, I've been working for very nearly 40 years. And, you know, I've changed career in that, but you can see that the youngsters of today are likely to have at least 2 careers, maybe 3 careers. So you want to give them as many tools to be able to do those pivots and make those changes at the right moment. And I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are some quite exciting ideas about how we can modify education systems now. And I think we do need to think about that really hard. But just broadening that toolkit and thinking of education as providing the toolkit to explore a myriad of different areas, whether you want to be that medieval historian doing incredible original research on papers that are buried in a library somewhere over here, versus somebody working on the most leading edge of technology. Both are fantastic things to do. And we just need to make sure that we get the right balance between, you know, who is doing what, and are they really pursuing the thing that is most interesting to them, most valuable to the world around them, and kind of get that balance right.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point. And in the UK, we do face some pretty serious challenges, you know, flat productivity. We've got AI, we've got the green economy. You've been talking quite a lot about education, but also the fact that careers are long, you know, 50 plus years, and they pivot. Do you think we talk enough about the leadership and management skills needed at all levels and all these sectors to really face into these challenges? Do you think we value it enough?
I think that's such a good question. I mean, I think when I compare now versus 20 years ago, there's far more really high quality and thoughtful management training and education and upskilling available, and delivered, again, technology has helped us, delivered in ways that can be consumed at the right moment for you, whether you're, you know, listening to a podcast and you're doing your washing up, or whether you're actually sitting in a room and, you know, co-creating something with a random set of people that you're working with for the first time and going through all of the exercises and the fun that comes with that. So, you know, I think it's much better than it was, but I think we still have a little bit of a tendency to believe, or to allow the belief that careers are kind of a single path, a unitary path, and everything that is valuable has to be a step up. Whereas actually, particularly in large organizations, but I'm sure this is true in small organizations as well, very often the most skillful people are those who have learned how to do the horizontal. They've done more than one role, possibly at a similar level, in different areas of the business or in different sorts of companies, so that rather than thinking that career progression is a set of linear steps climbing up this ladder, it's much more holistic. They have a real 360-degree view of the customer, or of the organization they're working for, or of the problems that we're trying to solve. And they are very, very valuable people in an organization. Now, I've always found that is one of the hardest things to, in a mid-sized organization, which we are, to really make happen in a programmatic way. If you're a really, really big company, you've got more options about moving people around. If you're in a really small company, actually you have to do a bit of everything anyway, usually. For mid-sized companies, you kind of need your specialists because you can't, and you don't necessarily have too many of your specialists. So you don't necessarily want them distracted by doing other things, but actually in the long run, blending that specialism with that wider generic view is really important. So I feel we've made progress. I think there's more that we need to do and we should do. The productivity point for the UK is a really complex one, and it's not just about training. It's not just about infrastructure, which isn't as smooth as it could be. I mean, there's a whole myriad of reasons why productivity remains a challenge. But if we can start at the organizational level by trying to think what it is that we need to do within our organizations and training our people to be the best that we can be, the best that they can be, we have a better chance of solving that productivity puzzle.
And you've worked obviously globally. You're in a global organization now. If you've had exposure to many cultures, including CERN in Switzerland. If you look at the UK's working or management culture versus your other international experiences, do you see any differences? Do you see any advantages or disadvantages? What do you think we could do better here?
I think I was very, very lucky that I started my professional career at CERN, which is one of the most international of international places. I mean, literally from the day you walk in the door, you are working with Italians and French people and Russians and Americans. And back in 1985, I remember my first conversation with somebody from mainland China, which was interesting because they hadn't been taught to speak English. They'd only been taught to read it. And, all sorts of challenges around about that. So I started from this extraordinary melting pot of different cultures, different backgrounds, different types of educational knowledge and experience. But the thing that united them was an absolutely clear-cut purpose. Everybody at CERN knew what they were looking for. What we now call the Higgs boson actually was what it was, but it was that unifying theory of matter. Higgs boson had not been named at that stage, but that's what we were all working towards. And so I suppose right from the outset, without ever thinking about it explicitly, diverse cultures bringing different perspectives and real clarity on the sense of purpose and what it is you're working towards, it were absolutely there in my whole career, because having experienced it right at the outset, you know what it feels like. And it's not about having fancy words on a page that everybody can repeat. It's not about anything to do with that. It's about truthful understanding of where it is you're trying to get to. That doesn't mean there aren't big arguments along the way and differences of view. Of course there are. So I think I was fortunate that I saw that at the outset. I would say when I came back into the UK and worked, I was working in technology consultancy, and I experienced a number of different firms in that sort of 2-3 year period when I was doing that. Certainly back in the 80s, many British organizations thought that success was carrying on doing what they'd always done without challenge. Now, that may be unfair, but that's the sense that I got in comparison with CERN, which was very international, very focused, very forward-looking on what was going next. So coming back to the UK and working over the last 30 years, I think we have unquestionably broadened our outlook. And I think there are some British organisations which are the very best examples of what an organisation can be anywhere in the world. But we shy away sometimes from addressing difficult problems and from changing things that need to be changed, but which seem quite intractable. And I think that can hold us back. We sometimes, I think, culturally fall back on process and framework rather than purpose and ambition. And I think that's something which we can learn from some other cultures and from some other organizations.
So that's really quite incredible. If I want to sum up the many lessons from this conversation, one is do have that diversity of thought and that sense of purpose. I think your recognition that you had that in your first working environment, was incredibly important to your own development. Secondly, trust, right? Because obviously having an atmosphere where you can trust, explore, have challenges, and don't be afraid to keep learning, to be ambitious and look to the future and forward around that common sense of purpose. I think these are excellent lessons, and thank you so much for sharing them. Now, we ask all of our guests on the leading issue, if you were in charge and you could pick one issue to focus on and solve, and by the way, problem solving would be the last piece of advice. You started out saying you're a natural born problem solver. So if you could solve that problem, what would it be? What would you choose to focus on?
That is a really tough question. I think the problem of our generation, indeed of our lifetime, is our planet is getting warm very quickly. And that is leading to all sorts of changes, that some of which we can predict and some of which I'm certain we are not yet predicting. Now, we can cross our fingers and we can hope that this is just one of those weird planetary cycles that we go through, and that there will be an event. Maybe it's a volcano like happened in the late 19th century, which gives us a big cloud which cools the planet down for us for a bit, and that will get us out of the hole. But I think existentially we have got to solve the problem of our planet getting too hot. Mm-hmm. And so if I had one wish, that would be the wish. I don't pretend that it's easy. I do think there is a lot of really interesting and very clever people that are now focused on finding ways that we couldn't even have thought of 2 or 3 years ago to make a difference. And I'm quite encouraged by some of that. The question is it happening fast enough, or before some of those quite nasty consequences really hit us? And I'm not sure about that. So that would be my one wish. Let's stop the planet overheating.
And the role, what role can businesses, perhaps financial services businesses, play in helping to achieve that?
I think financial services actually have stepped up to the plate really, really well. I can't say that we've done everything perfectly. Of course, we've not. But in terms of when we think about, as an investment management house, how we try and orient the investments that we make towards that technology of the future. So think about how we can both give the people who trust us with their money a really good return, but at the same time, make sure that it's directionally taking us where we need to go from a planetary point of view. And I think, financial returns really, really matter. And making sure that we don't make the planet worse is also probably quite important to them over the long run too. So this it's a complex issue. So I think financial services has been trying, to get involved in that. But I think in businesses in general, there's some stuff that is within everybody's control, and trying to control that, buying your green energy, thinking about your footprint of your travel, all of those sort of things really, really matter, and making sure that we keep the agenda clear and we keep reminding our political leaders that this is something which future generations will look back and judge our generation on, them included. So we won't get everything right, but we should try in the things that were within our control, and we should also identify those things which aren't in our control, but through collective collaboration we can come together and make a difference on. And I think we've got some examples, the COP meetings are obviously trying to do that, and there are others, not perfect, but direction of travel is right, and we just need to keep doing that.
Great. Well, Anne, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's been a pleasure discussing with you today on the leading issue. Thank you again to Dame Anne Richard, CMI's Lifetime Achievement Award winner. Thank you. And thanks for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.